Well, welcome back to our walk and talk sessions. And as you know, I've been talking about what's been happening with Ukraine post Donald Trump becoming the president. But I wanted to just talk a little bit about Christian ethics and how we look at these issues. And I've decided that what I'm not going to attempt to do, because we want these videos to be a little bit shorter and punchier, and I'm not going to attempt to give a prescriptive, this is the sort of the biblical Christian insight onto what is happening. You'll be able to pick up the stuff I've written on Faith Root, and we'll keep writing. You'll be able to sort of thread things together. But I just wanted to make a couple of comments about how we go about doing it and why we go about doing it. I'm going to start with some of the whys, and I'm going to come back to another why at the end. Here are some of the whys. First of all, we do it. We seek to have a biblical, a Christian ethic, a view on what is happening in the wider world around us, because we are living in this world. And so we want to see the world and what is happening as God sees it. And the first thing that means is we want to think about our feelings, our affections, our values. How are we meant to feel about what is happening in the world around us? And what might that tell us about what we value, what is important to us? Because thinking about what God would say about, and what God thinks about, and what God's desire is when it comes to Ukraine and Russia and the United States and Donald Trump and Vladimir Zelensky and Vladimir Putin, what God's will in terms of those things and what God's perspective on it is, tells us about what matters to God and therefore what should matter to us. It tells us where our heart's treasure is, where we are storing up treasure. And we will come back to that towards the end. So actually, how am I meant to respond in my emotions? That will drive my response in my prayer and in my worship, and those things matter. But also, it will have an impact on what we say. And I recognise that most, if not all of us involved in this particular conversation, have little power to affect change. We don't have the ear of presidents and prime ministers. And we may feel powerless about it. But we can speak. And it might be that what we say gets heard and gets picked up and filters through. And there are Christians who will get themselves into, or God will put into positions where they do have the ear of prime ministers and presidents, just as God put Daniel and Joseph into the presence of emperors and pharaohs, just as God gave Paul the opportunity to speak to Roman authorities. We presume even the emperor himself. And whilst that might not be us today, that might be members of your church, friends, your children, your grandchildren, in future situations. So we want to learn about what is happening now, not just for how we respond now, but for how we might respond in similar situations in the future. And that's really where we're wanting Christian ethics to be, to help us not just respond to this specific situation, but to think about how we respond to any situation, to see the similarities and the differences between them. And by getting God's value, God's perspective, to know what is important, what matters. And thirdly, it will help us to think about what we do, whether that's how we vote, what we participate in. And there's a bit more of a chance that some of us might be involved in that way, that some of us may have to make decisions. I've mentioned on the blog decisions about what it means to be involved, whether that's working for a defence manufacturer, a defence supplier, whether that's involvement in banking and lending and investing, whether that's actually being in the armed forces, and a question about serving, or whether to go into the armed forces. So there may be implications about what we do. Again, they will all come back to what we value and knowing what God values. Now, and I've realised I was meant to talk about a bit more about what we speak, what we say, because I think it affects how we teach, how we preach, and those of you that have the gift, how we prophesy, that learning to see what is going around us will affect the world around us and what we say to it and what we say to the church. So again, if you've been following Faith Roots, you'll realise that a couple of times I've picked up on touch points, connecting points between different Bible passages and what is happening in Ukraine. I picked up on this when I preached on Nehemiah 13 and the challenge of compromise. I picked up on this in Obadiah of the warning against trying to stay aloof or pretending to be aloof from a situation, and how that can draw us in. And those Bible passages are, the way we're meant to preach them is to apply them through Christ to the church. So they're not specifically about Ukraine, and that's not how I would generally approach preaching. But the connecting points are there for us all to see. The dangers are there for us all to see. And this is where I just want to come back to why Christian ethics matter, why understanding and seeing these things, thinking about them, understanding, knowing what's going on, thinking biblically, thinking clearly about these things matters. You see, in the end, look, we can have our opinions about who is right and who is wrong, what happened at the White House the other week. You can see, you know what my view is. What I think we've got to be very careful about doing is judging the character, judging the heart, judging the motives of others. We may have a strong feeling, a strong opinion. One thing I think is worth saying is human nature means that even when we see wrong motives with people, that when they claim to be acting from good motives, it's right to take that at face value. Our motives are mixed. So an important aspect of Christian ethics is the point made many years ago by, I can't remember who, a famous theologian, that I'm doing that thing I'm not meant to do in quoting other people, even worse when you don't know who it was, that the dividing line between good and evil runs often not between people, certainly not between peoples, nations, ethnic groups, but runs down the middle of people. And so the main reason that we want to think about Christian ethics is to understand what God values, what God says is good and right, and what God says is wrong, so that we can address our own hearts. Because that's where the real battle is, the battle that really matters. It's easy for me to, in the comfort of my life in North Birmingham, to have big opinions about what Donald Trump should do, what Vladimir Zelensky should do, what Keir Starmer should do. But the reality is that I am not in their position. I don't face the same specific challenges and pressures that they're under. I'm not having to juggle the balance between how do I keep my voter base happy, how do I look after the interests of my country, and at the same time, my own interests. How do I consider what is actually achievable and realistic, and at the same time ensure that I am doing what is right and good, and do the things that I care about in that way? I'm not under that kind of pressure. I don't have to make decisions, just as I didn't during the pandemic. I don't have to make, when there were big ethical debates as well, I don't have to make decisions that could affect millions of lives, even cost millions of lives potentially. And I thank God that I don't have to make those kinds of decisions. And that should motivate me again to pray for those that do, however I feel about them. And yet, whilst I don't face the same pressures in terms of scale, I do face the same pressures. That actually, you and I, whether it's in our own personal life, our family life, if it's in our work, our careers, whether it's in what is going on in our churches, our networks, our ministries, we are facing the same kinds of pressures and the same kinds of temptations and the same kinds of opportunities. The reality is I don't know how I would respond, how I would act. I've got a hope, a feeling, an aspiration of how I would want to act if I was in Keir Starmer's shoes. Side point, I could not ever possibly be President of the United States. I am not ever going to be Prime Minister of the United Kingdom, but actually there was a time when I had an interest in politics and got involved. I was a member of a party and was campaigning, and actually at that point my own personal ambition was get elected as an MP, get into cabinet, maybe one day run for office to be Prime Minister. God stripped those ambitions away, and I'm thankful that he did, because I really don't know how I would respond in those situations. And I'm glad that burden is not on me. But I do know how I'm responding to those types of pressures in my life now. I know how I've responded to them in the past, and I know how I should respond to them in the future. So in the end, our aim when looking at bigger, wider picture is not just so that we can share our opinions on things we have no influence on. Our aim is to come back and think about where we do have responsibility. And incidentally, that's why when I preached on Obadiah and when I preached on Nehemiah, whilst I made a passing comment, if you like, I reflected, I used as an example what was going on in the wider world. My application was not to the wider world. My application was to the church and the house in front of me.